Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria and Eastern Antique Arms. And for those of you who follow my Eastern Antique Arms Facebook page, link below, and also of course I have a website where I sell swords and stuff, but I also put up articles. Now a little while ago I put up an article based on a range of 1796 light cavalry sabre weights and balances. Okay, so that's this model of sword. This is an officer's version, slightly different from the normal, but I've just pulled one out at random. Obviously I've got a bunch of them here, and they do vary in weight and balance. Now, as I mentioned in that article linked below, there are some strange things written on the internet about this model of sword. Now, first thing to say, of course, this is a very, very popular model of sword, and I know people whose primary interest is longsword or rapier or all kinds of other things that aren't British military sabre that love this sword. It's just, there's something special about the shape of it, isn't there? It's whether it's the sweet kind of curve of that, you could say, P shape to the knuckle bow, or whether it's the fact that the blade broadens with that very broad, shallow fuller with this hatchet tip. It looks the business, doesn't it? It just looks a really, really cool shape. I've spoken about these in the past in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. They're not the most amazing swords in the world to use, but they are good swords, and they were popular. They were very popular amongst British cavalry in the Napoleonic period. They were introduced, well, it's the 1796 pattern, so there's a bit of a clue there. They probably didn't actually reach most light cavalry regiments until about 1797, 1798, perhaps even later in some cases. So the previous model, the 1788 pattern, was probably still in use until about 1800 in the case of some regiments. And in fact, the designer of this sword, John Gaspard Le Marchant, you notice the French name, his family actually were from Jersey. So he was British, but French name, originally a French family. And he was a cavalry commander who actually fought during the Peninsular War, and he was a heroic, great cavalry commander, and he designed this model of sword based on his interaction and experience with swords that he'd seen in use in the Austrian army or Austro-Hungarian Empire in the period before he was engaged in the Peninsula. So based on his experience with Austrian swords and his own views on swordsmanship, he not only designed this sword with a certain manufacturer called Osborne, and he designed this sword. He also designed the heavy pattern, which if you watch the series of Sharp films with Sean Bean, then you'd recognise he uses the 1796 heavy cavalry sword, despite the fact that he's an officer of rifles, but there's a story behind that. Very, very different swords to each other. That sword is what we would usually refer to as a palash. You could call it a backsword, but they're all forms of backsword in a sense because they're all single-edged, but it's kind of a palash. It shares some features in common with the light model in that it has a hatchet tip and it's primarily a cutting sword. In fact, prior to the Battle of Waterloo, a number of those heavy swords were spear pointed to make them more effective at thrusting, allegedly to make the British heavies more effective against the French cuirassiers, who are of course wearing, as their name would suggest, cuirasses or cuirasse, so a breastplate and helmet, and they were told to give point or thrust rather than chopping at them for more effectiveness. Although we know that cutting at their arms and legs and face was effective and was done during the Battle of Waterloo and during the Napoleonic Wars in general. But back to the light model, there is a lot of rubbish written about these swords, about what they were capable of and what they, well, for example, there's a very pervasive myth that the French during the Napoleonic Wars complained about these swords. I've even seen some people assert that the French tried to get them banned. Banned by who? The Geneva Convention? I don't know. The French tried to complain about these swords and get them banned because of the horrific wounds they dealt. Well, this is absolute rubbish, propaganda rubbish, for a number of reasons. Firstly, the French had not identical, but they had similar types of curved sabre in their own light cavalry regiments. But in addition to which, there is no mechanism for the French kind of to, complain about a certain type of sword being used. And there's also no real evidence that these dealt particularly more fearsome wounds than any other type of sword or backsword or whatever, broadsword that was in use during those wars. There are a few other things. So people have made replicas of these in modern times. There's a couple of companies. Cold Steel make a replica. It kind of vaguely looks like the 1796, doesn't really feel like it. There's a company, Universal Swords of India, that make a replica. Handles a bit like a crowbar, unfortunately. So there are companies that have made replicas of these. I'm sure there's other companies out there. I have never felt a replica 1796 light cavalry sabre, unfortunately, that feels anything like an original. And I have to say, if a company did make a replica 1796 light cavalry sabre, and I do know of a custom one actually, Marco Dinelli of Dinelli Armories, based on measurements that I gave him, incidentally, completely willingly, did make a replica that I never got to handle, but I do understand handles pretty close to an original. But in terms of mass production, unfortunately, no company is making one really that handles like an original. And if a company did, I'm sure it would be a great seller, because these do cut well. I have cut with sharpened antiques of these that were conducive to test cutting because they weren't in particularly good condition and already had sharpened edges and just had the edges brought up to cutting sharp. They do cut well. They don't cut like legendarily, mythically well. They cut on a par with many types of medieval arming sword or types of backsword, other types of sabre, langmesser, things like this. So they do cut well, but they're not like freakishly monstrous cutters. I've got to say, in terms of Victorian swords, I think some of the cutlasses, some of the naval cutlasses, arguably cut even better than these. But of course, cutlasses are shorter and relatively heavy for their size. But if we look at the Victorian era sword feats, so cutting of sheep carcasses or lead bars or things like this, branches of trees, they did use adapted versions of ships' cutlasses. So even they recognised that the cutlass was a particularly good cutter. But these are good cutters. But perhaps more importantly so, they're good cutters relative to their weight. Now, they are relatively light swords. If you look at this sword, and let's just grab a random, there we go, this is actually not a very good sword to grab, but we grab a non-regulation, I'll talk about this in a separate video actually, because this is quite an interesting sword, recent acquisition. But this is a Victorian thrust-centric sword, as you can see, from the 1860s, 1863 to be precise, made by Wilkinson, and it's the so-called Toledo style blade, thrusting blade. And you'll see that this sword looks very much more dainty or narrower than this sword, and yet they weigh about the same. They both weigh about 800 grams, well, just over, in fact, nearer 850. And the fact of the matter is that despite this fact that this sword is very broad, they are very thin and flexible. Okay, so this portion of the blade from there up is very, very thin. And also it has this very broad and I won't say necessarily shallow, actually I've referred to it as a shallow filler, but actually at its maximum depth it's probably actually quite deep. But because it's got a very broad filler in the blade, or groove in the blade, that reduces a lot of weight as well, whilst maintaining rigidity. So actually what you end up with is a blade that for its width is actually really quite light, and because it's light, that means you can handle it effectively. You can accelerate it quickly. You can move it around quickly. So whether it's being able to initiate a cut one and then switch to a cut number two, despite the fact that it's a broad blade, you can do that quickly. You can change the angles of the sword really, really quickly and move it around. You can accelerate it quickly. From there to there, you can move through a target with enough force to produce a very effective slash with minimum energy and without having to swing the sword like it's a heavy object. So you can move these swords really, really quickly. But because you've got the width there and you've got effectively quite a concentration of a breadth of the blade, should we say, up towards the tip, it has quite a lot of inertia that it strikes with. And because of the shape of that hatchet tip, yes, it's less effective at thrusting through clothes or any kind of uniform, but because of the shape of that tip, much like a katana or certain types of falchion, indeed it can cut really quite effectively right the way up to here. So although it's a 32 or 32 to 33 inch blade, they are usually, although it's not a particularly long blade, remember you can still hit someone right at the end of the blade and it will make an effective wound, it will make an effective cut. Whereas a sword like this, which has a 34.5 inch blade, so it's technically a longer blade, if I try and produce an effective cut up there, it's not really going to do it because it's a narrow blade. Just doesn't have much breadth up there, it doesn't really have the correct edge geometry. This is designed for thrusting. It's not a sword that's really, I mean, you can cut with it, but if you want to cut effectively, you need to be hitting down here. So although this is technically a longer blade, in terms purely of cutting, you can actually cut from further away with the 1796, like Cavalry Sabre. And also remember that when you hit a target, especially on horseback, but on foot as well, when you hit a target, you're going to enter that target and then you want your weapon to be free again. You don't want your weapon to become stuck in the target. If you have a large amount of blade beyond your centre of percussion or beyond the portion that you're cutting with, it becomes harder to draw out that blade. If you're hitting up towards the tip and you've got a nice hatchet point, it will enter the target, slice into it and exit the target more easily. So as a cutting arm, as a cutting weapon, which is obviously what this is, and the curve facilitates this as well, this is a far more effective tool. Now, I talked about the popularity of these. These were very popular in their time, and there is some evidence in the newspapers and other sources of the period that when the 1822 pattern, which I will talk about more in, I've talked about them in the past, but the 1821 pattern, like Cavalry Trooper's sword, which replaced this, came along. It's got a more protective hilt and it's got a compromised cut and thrust blade. But when that came in, there is some suggestion that it wasn't particularly popular. It's got greater reach, it's better for thrusting, but people really loved these swords. And we know for a fact that these were retained within yeomanry regiments and potentially even within some regular army regiments until well after 1821, when the new model came in officially, although it probably didn't filter out to the actual regiments until maybe about 1824. But even into the 1830s, it's evident that this sword was still in use with certainly with some yeomanry regiments and probably regular as well. But even more than that, in India, this sword was so popular that they started remaking it. So in the 1850s, as I've mentioned about in many of my videos, what we in Britain tend to refer to as the Indian Mutiny, referred to in India as the First Indian War of Independence, debatable whether it is or not, but that war of 1857 that ran through to 1858, and in some parts you could say 59, mopping up actions and all of that. These swords, in some cases, were brought back into service. Now, there's a suggestion that Hodson of Hodson's Horse, when he went into Delhi, discovered a store of these, liberated them and issued them to his men. Hodson's Horse, named after his regiment, named after himself, that he'd raised. Irregular horsemen, mostly made up incidentally of Sikhs, Afghans, or Pathans as they were called. So people from far away from Bengal. So the mutiny was in Bengal and Oud, and these were men, that all of his men were from, let's say, what's now India and Pakistan and Afghanistan, recruited into his force as irregulars, and they came down to the south and fought under British command against the rebellious Bengal army. These swords, the original ones, referred to as the Old Dragoon Sabre, or I've even seen it referred to as the Crooked Old Dragoon Sword, crooked as in bent, because by that point they were generally speaking using slightly straighter blades, only slightly curved. And these were pushed into service and they were used and they were much loved. In some cases they were mounted into tulwar hilts, so were put into native Indian hilts of various styles, not only tulwar hilts, other types of hilts as well. I've even seen them in Kandar style basket hilts. So very popular blades. Certain makers like Osborne and Gill and these very good makers were rated highly by the Indian cavalry troopers. They knew what the good makes were, they knew which had the best temper and the best steel, and they sought out those blades and mounted them as they liked them. They were very loved, and so much so that eventually the original old ones ran out, and the famous company Robert Mole and Sons of Birmingham started remaking them. So what this is, it looks like a 1796 light cavalry sabre. This is actually an Indian-made version by Mull, probably from the 1850s or 60s. Okay, probably I'd say the 1860s, so it's probably post-mutiny. This one, incidentally, is very extensively sharpened and has a fair amount of edge damage from hitting things. So for all I know, this could have been used in the mutiny or potentially in the little conflicts that happened in the 1860s and 70s. But as you see, it's essentially the old Napoleonic 1796 pattern in use 50, 60 years later. Okay, so it came back. Now, coming back to the original point of this video, so I put an article up. If you haven't read it already, please go and have a look at it. I think it's short and moderately interesting, which is, you know, there we go, I wrote it. So it's not exactly a glowing endorsement, but there you go. Hopefully you'll find it slightly interesting, and it'll probably take you 5 minutes to read. And it is about the weights and balances of these. But moreover, and the reason I'm making this video now, this kind of update video to that article, is because Richard Deller, who is a bit of a legend in the sword collecting world, okay, he wrote the British Cavalry Sword, and I'll put a link to that below on Amazon actually. He saw my article and thought that's a good idea, and went away and measured, or weighed rather, some of his 1796 light cavalry sabres and the 1796 heavy cavalry swords, the Palash, as well, and produced a little table. So the link below to the Eastern Antique Arms Facebook page and the forum where he posted that as well. I put all of those links below to everything relevant, basically. I'll try and get all those links in there. So you can see his table of weights, and you'll see that really the ranges of these swords, officers' swords tend to be lighter than the troopers' swords. There's a good reason for that. Hutton actually talks about it in The Cavalry Swordsman, which is a good manual of his from 1867. Not a lot of people know about the manual, but it's really good. I highly recommend it. It even talks about sharpening. And in there, he talks about the fact that cavalry swords made for troopers, so they're government procured, government provided to the privates, so troopers of the cavalry. Officers buy their own, their private purchase. So the government-made weapons tend to be overweight. And the reason for that is they're overbuilt to increase durability. Okay, the fact is that recruited soldiers tend not to treat their kit as carefully as private purchase officer swords would be treated. So therefore, the government wants to save money, as always, and so therefore it asks for the swords to be slightly overbuilt so that they're more likely to take abuse, not get damaged, last longer, cost less in the long run. Less replacement, less maintenance. And so, you know, he quite rightly says government procured things are overbuilt for that reason. And we see the same thing today with modern military rifles. If you look at a rifle that someone privately purchases for shooting at the range, might not necessarily be the case in all places if you look at an AR-15 or whatever, but if you want to, you can have a private civilian rifle made a lot lighter than you'd really want a military rifle. If we look at World War I and World War II, then things like the Lee Enfield and the Mauser and whatever else tend to be bigger and chunkier and heavier and have more wood on them than you necessarily need on a civilian rifle, because it's there to protect the weapon. It's a similar thing with making government procured swords slightly heavier than they need to be. The officers' weapons tend to be lighter, so we sometimes see officers' swords, versions of these, as light as even 700 grams. But we see equally some officers' and troopers' weapons as heavy as nearly 1,000 grams. So the range of weight of these, despite the fact that they were more or less a standard design-ish, they could vary by quite a lot, between about 700 and 1,000 grams. But most of them that survive and have been weighed, that I've seen so far, seem to range usually from about 850 grams to about 950 grams. That seems to be the sweet spot in the middle where most of them sit. So all those interesting links below. If you're interested in these sorts of swords, there's actually some for sale on my website at the moment, but they're highly desirable swords. They're, as far as my sales are concerned, they're pretty much the most popular type of antique sword out there. Very nice. They're becoming harder to get hold of, and unfortunately there are no good replicas about. So if you can get hold of a nice 1796, buy it, keep it, look after it, okay, because they're not getting easier to get hold of. Yeah, have a look at those articles. I hope this has been interesting, and I will see you really soon for another fun and educational video. Cheers for watching. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.